Hey folks, David Stewart here. The Pareto Principle versus the Black Swan Effect. I wanted to quickly discuss the differences between these two. Lately, I've been talking a lot about the Black Swan Effect when it comes to these highly explosive cultural events like Harry Potter or Twilight or 50 Shades of Grey or the Beatles or Michael Jackson. These huge, singular, massively popular cultural artifacts of art. And some people have said, well, I think you're talking about the Pareto Principle. And I wanted to just kind of talk about the difference between those two. The Pareto Principle has been gaining a lot of traction in the internet philosophy circles for the last year or two, which is good because it's cool to talk about this. Basically, Stefan Molyneux's been talking about it. Jordan Peterson's been talking about it. That means we all end up talking about it. And it's a cool idea. Basically, it was coined by this Italian economist named Vilfredo Pareto, and he looked at the distribution of land ownership in Italy and found that 20% of people owned 80% of the land, and he found that this distribution effect was present in lots of places. So he looked at income distribution and found this. So some people call it the 80-20 rule. 20% of people have 80% of wealth, or 20% of people generate 80% of the productivity. The square root of workers generates more than half the wealth of the company. These sorts of things. So there's a smaller number of people are creating a huge percentage of the value. That's the idea of the Pareto principle. And we can discuss this in depth of like what this means for inequality, and obviously it's an explanation for how inequality comes to exist and a description of inequality. But this is something very distinct from the Black Swan effect. So the Pareto principle might be operating in music and might be operating in books. In fact, it probably is. I haven't done the numbers, but it probably is. That's distinct from the Black Swan effect. The Black Swan effect is about these singular momentous events that are highly unpredictable, meaning they can't be predicted beforehand. So if we look at the Beatles as an example, which is this monolithic, explosive bit of cultural popularity, so popular that it's like, in their particular genre of rock, in any given year, they sold like half of all the records that were sold, right? Like that's how popular they were in the 60s. It's unbelievable to think about how many records they sold compared to what people were selling before. And that's what kind of made them the Black Swan. Is prior to their explosion and their massive gaining of popularity, that event wasn't predicted ahead of time. And you can look at it and be like, okay, they were successful because of this bit of novelty, the way they marketed this, their look. You can come up with a big list of things, but that doesn't really help you because that event already happened and you're explaining it, and you can't predict the next one because it's going to have a bunch of unpredictable factors that you haven't even thought about yet. So that's the idea of the Black Swan. So these are singular events that produce something that's way more extreme than the 80-20 rule. So the 80-20 is like, 20% have 80%. When it comes to the Black Swan, it'd be like J.K. Rowling, one person, sells more books than multiple genres have in an entire decade, right? Like that's the level of distribution. It's insane. It's like a tiny fraction of a percent versus the 20-80. And what's important about the Black Swan is not thinking about the distribution of income, but thinking about scalability, which means when something can be highly scalable, you have a chance for a really extreme Black Swan event. Is scalability and unpredictability. Those are the two things that are really important. Now, if you're not familiar with who coined the Black Swan term, it's a guy named Nassim Taleb, who's an economist and a philosopher. Very interesting writer, though a lot of people don't like his writing style in his books because he just kind of says stuff, and it's an interesting read. But you find that these observations are mostly true. And what's interesting about the unpredictability part of it is that because it's so random, you can't really apply merit to it. There's no specific merit to the Beatles' success. Now, you can come up with reasons that they had success, but the point of merit is that you can predict ahead of time who's going to be good. If you have a meritorious candidate applying for your company, you can see his credentials or his history, his work history, and you can determine what kind of productivity he's going to do in the future. So the Pareto principle, there's probably a lot of merit involved in that, right? Like if you have a great hardworking indie author who's selling a lot of books and really riding to the market, he may not be part of this black swan effect. He's just a really competent writer and a good marketer, and he's generating a lot of that wealth. That's merit. This is why I talk about sometimes the meritocracy is somewhat illusory, because you can't apply it to some of these black swan effects. Like, do you really think Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey, which started off as Twilight fan fiction, are good pieces of literature? Chances are you don't think they're good pieces of literature if you're watching this channel. And if you do like them, that's okay, because lots of people like them. So no one would have predicted that 50 Shades of Grey would be this explosive event that it was, and no one's going to look at 50 Shades of Grey and be like, there's merit to it simply because people like it. The point of merit is that it's a predictable thing. You hire someone based on merit. You want outcomes to happen because of merit, because people have done well with their job, not because of a random event. You can't look at 50 Shades of Grey and be like, this is some really well-written literature. It's just something that, because of like a random assemblage of things in the culture, it was able to explode and become popular. So that's the thing that you have to think about with the Black Swan, is because it's unpredictable, merit is usually not involved. It's usually luck, for lack of a better term. It's randomness. But that doesn't mean that you don't try to apply meritorious standards when you have people apply to your company, or try to be a great, if you're an author, try to be a really good businessman. You of course want to do those things because you can still be part of that Pareto distribution. But the Black Swan is a different kind of event, and you shouldn't count on being a Black Swan. That's where people make their mistake. So they think they're going to party all day, party all night, write some music, and they're going to be the next Nirvana. Nirvana didn't think they were going to be the next Nirvana. Nirvana had no ability to or Kurt Cobain at least had no ability to cope with the fame and the success that came from this random event that was Nirvana. And even if you look at Nirvana, I mean, from my opinion of Nirvana is that there's nothing special about Nirvana that's good. Like Nirvana, I don't hear Nirvana and be like, this is as good as Dream Theater. I hear it and I'm like, I get why things aligned so that they were popular in the early 90s, but I don't think it's like specially good music. It's essentially a random event, and that's what you have to think about with comparing these two ideas. They're distinct phenomenon, but one can happen within the other, and they're not exclusive to one another. Okay, so hopefully that's interesting to talk about. Leave me your thoughts down below, because it's always an interesting discussion. I think it's good to attempt to be part of that 20%, and then if you hit the jackpot with some massively explosive thing, if you're in a highly scalable environment, then that's good too. But you shouldn't bank on the scalability creating billions of dollars for you. Okay, so have a good one, and I'll see you guys next time.